Hey juniors! So on Friday we talked about Jamestown and Plymouth Colony and why they were established. So we recall that Jamestown was established for land and new resources for England, and that Plymouth Colony was established by the Pilgrims who were looking to escape religious persecution in England. Today we're going to talk about slavery in the colonies in North America. So, there are some things I want us to think about. Very often in history, there are a lot of forgotten stories. We very often see events that we just aren't proud of. And not everyone has a chance to tell their story, and frankly, some stories are flat out ignored. So, oftentimes, the person who writes the story gets the final say in what is written. Important testimony from slaves and other minorities is often left out. For example, our textbook, the person who wrote it got the final say as to what was in it. So you always should be questioning the material around you. There are two types of sources as historians. A primary source is a first-hand account from someone who lived during that era, such as a diary, a letter, or an interview. So later on, you'll see we're going to read an account from a slave as to what their life was like in America, and that is considered a primary source because that person actually lived through slavery. However, a secondary source is written by someone who wasn't there and wrote about it later. So a good example of this would be your history textbook. So our essential question for the day is, why was slavery a part of colonist life? And what did it feel like to be a slave? So go ahead and take a second and pause the video and write down our essential question in your notebook. Okay, so we know when we talked last about colonization that England had settled in Virginia and Massachusetts. However, by the time colonization was over, they had expanded into the 13 original colonies. So Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. All the colonies had different economies, but most grew crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. Indigo is a special dye that's grown that dyes things blue. And it was mostly the southern colonies that had these large crop plantations. Now, the question was, now that agriculture was established, who was going to do the work? The brutal work of being out in the fields, tending to the tobacco, the rice, and other crops. Who was going to do that labor? Before we start talking about slaves, I want us to think about something that Malcolm X said. Almost all Americans can trace their ancestry back to like the Pilgrims or Jamestown or English settlers that came over to North America. However, mostly speaking, those from slave descent can't do that. So I want us to take a second and watch this video on Malcolm X and think about what he's saying about his forefathers.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. Because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. If you're interested in freedom, you need some judo, you need some karate, you need all the things that will help you fight for freedom. Nationalism is the wave of the present and the future. It is nationalism that's bringing freedom to oppressed people all over the world. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Algerians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Nigerians.
Okay, that's enough of that. He is very powerful. Alright, so I think the main points from that video, Malcolm X is essentially saying Africans were brought to America against their will. They were brought here against their will to do the labor of other people because they were considered inferior. So, when Americans talk about their history, you always have to ask, what is my history? Alright, so back to colonization. So basically, after the English settled in North America, they began to grow crops at a rapid pace. Once all the colonies were established, the colonies existed based on profits that they got from cash crops. So remember on Friday when we said that Jamestown was basically saved because tobacco started making money for them? This is the same idea. These colonies were able to exist because they sold the crops that they grew to other countries and made money off of it. So other southern colonies such as North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia did the same thing that Jamestown and Virginia was doing, and they began growing indigo, tobacco, and rice. But, as I said earlier, a workforce was needed in order to grow large amounts of crops that would make enough money to keep the colonies going. So, initially, when the colonists arrived, they actually wanted to use Native Americans for slaves. Christopher Columbus even says in one of his diary entries, "Wow, these Native Americans would make great servants and slaves for us." However, there were two main issues. First, large numbers of Native Americans got diseases from the Europeans when the Europeans first came over, and this killed millions of them. The second problem was that Native Americans knew North America way too well, and they kept escaping whenever they were captured. As a result, colonists looked to the African slave trade as a solution. After all, a slave is free. It's free labor that you don't have to pay for. So let's talk about the African slave trade. First of all, the slave trade had been going on for decades, way before slaves came to America. In fact, throughout history, almost every culture and race at some point has been enslaved, even back to the start of time. And you could be a slave for just about anything. If you owed a debt or got arrested, you could become a slave. But I don't want to discount the fact that the majority of African slaves were kidnapped and brought to America against their will. Slaves were chained and sent over in tight conditions on ships. And the journey from Africa to America is known as the Middle Passage. And this absolutely has to be written in your notebook. So take a second and write that last bullet point down. And you can see from this photo, these are actually people. So they show how the Middle Passage ships worked. These people are literally laying in rows on top of each other. Does that look comfortable to you in any way? Because it absolutely shouldn't. These were horrific conditions, and people often died. Alright, so once slaves got to America, they were often sold at auction and separated from their families. Can you imagine coming to a new place and then immediately being separated from your mom or dad? It was heartbreaking. Once they got to their plantations, slaves had very few rights and could be tortured, beaten, or killed for very small offenses, such as breaking a tool. They worked long hours on plantations doing farm work. Slave religion and song was a large part of their lives, and most of their songs were about sorrow, hope, agony, and joy. All of these bullet points do need to be copied down in your notebook, so make sure that you pause the video and take a second and write those down. So, the questions that I want you to think about from today's lesson is, why did the colonists use slaves instead of hired workers? And how do you think you would feel in this situation if you were a slave back then? So that's our lesson for today on the slave trade. We're going to move into a little bit of our guided and independent practice next.